It is a question of utmost interest whether these changes do or do not contribute to the independence and productivity of the individual mind. Do they foster a self-reliant personality, capable at need of pursuing high and rare aims, or have they rather a leveling tendency, repressive of what is original and characteristic? There are in fact opposite opinions regarding this matter, in support of either of which numerous expressions by writers of some weight might be collected. From one point of view, it would appear that the new communication ought to encourage individuality of all kinds. It makes it easier to get away from a given environment and to find support in one more congenial. The world has grown more various and at the same time more accessible, so that one having a natural bent should be the more able to find influences to nourish it. If he has a turn, say, for entomology, he can readily, through journals, correspondence, and meetings, get in touch with a group of men similarly inclined and with a congenial tradition. And so with any sect of religion, or politics, or art, or whatnot. If there are in the civilized world a few like-minded people, it is comparatively easy for them to get together in spirit and encourage one another in their peculiarity. It is a simple and recognized principle of development that an enlarged life in the organism commonly involves greater differentiation in its parts. That the social enlargement of recent times has in general this character seems plain, and has been set forth in much detail by some writers, notably by Herbert Spencer. Many indeed find the characteristic evil of the new era in an extreme individuality, a somewhat anarchic differentiation and working at cross purposes. Probably there was never any time, says Professor Mackenzie, in which men tended to be so unintelligible to each other as they are now, on account of the diversity of the objects with which they are engaged, and of the points of view at which they stand. On the other hand, we have what we may call the dead level theory, of which de Tocqueville, in his Democracy in America, was apparently the chief author. Modern conditions, according to this, break down all limits to the spread of ideas and customs. Great populations are brought into one mental whole, through which movements of thought run by a contagion like that of the mob. And instead of the individuality which was fostered by former obstacles, we have a universal assimilation. Each locality, it is pointed out, had formerly its peculiar accent and mode of dress, while now dialects are disappearing and almost the same fashions prevail throughout the civilized world. This uniformity in externals is held to be only the outward and visible sign of a corresponding leveling of ideas. People, it is said, have a passion to be alike, which modern appliances enable them to gratify. Already in the 18th century, Dr. Johnson complained that commerce has left the people no singularities, and in our day many hold with John Burroughs that constant intercommunication, the friction of travel, of streets, of books, of newspapers, make us all alike. We are, as it were, all pebbles upon the same shore, washed by the same waves. The key to this matter, in my judgment, is to perceive that there are two kinds of individuality, one of isolation and one of choice, and that modern conditions foster the latter while they efface the former. They tend to make life rational and free instead of local and accidental. They enlarge indefinitely the competition of ideas, and whatever has owed its persistence merely to lack of comparison is likely to go, while that which is really congenial to the choosing mind will be all the more cherished and increased. Human nature is enfranchised and works on a larger scale as regards both its conformities and its nonconformities. Something of this may be seen in the contrast between town and country, the latter having more of the individuality of isolation, the former of choice. The rural environment, says Mr. R. L. Hart, speaking of country villages in New England, is psychically extravagant. It tends to extremes. A man carries himself out to his logical conclusions. He becomes a concentrated essence of himself. I traveled some years ago among the mountains of North Carolina, at that time wholly unreached by modern industry and communication, and noticed that not only was the dialect of the region as a whole distinct from that of neighboring parts of the country, but that even adjoining valleys often showed marked differences. Evidently, this sort of local individuality, characteristic of an illiterate people living on their own corn, pork, and neighborhood traditions, can hardly survive the new communication. It must be said, however, that rural life has other conditions that foster individuality in a more wholesome way than mere isolation and are a real advantage in the growth of character. Among these are control over the immediate environment, the habit of face-to-face struggle with nature, and comparative security of economic position. All these contribute to the self-reliance upon which the farming people justly pride themselves. In the city, we find an individuality less picturesque but perhaps more functional. There is more facility for the formation of specialized groups, and so for the fostering of special capacities. Notwithstanding the din of communication and trade, the cities are, for this reason, the chief seats of productive originality in art, science, and letters. The difference is analogous to that between the development of natural species on islands or other isolated areas, and on a wide and traversable continent. The former produces many quaint species, like the kangaroos, which disappear when brought into contact with more capable types. But the continent by no means brings about uniformity. It engenders rather a complex organism of related species and varieties, each of which is comparatively perfect in its special way, and has become so through the very fact of a wider struggle for existence. So, easy communication of ideas favors differentiation of a rational and functional sort, as distinguished from the random variations fostered by isolation. And it must be remembered that any sort is rational and functional that really commends itself to the human spirit. Even revolt from an ascendant type is easier now than formerly because the rebel can fortify himself with the triumphant records of the nonconformers of the past. It is then probable that local peculiarity of speech and manner, and other curious and involuntary sorts of individuality, will diminish. And certainly a great deal is thus lost in the way of local color and atmosphere, of the racy flavor of isolated personalities and unconscious picturesqueness of social types. The diversities of dress, language, and culture which were developed in Europe during the Middle Ages, when each little barony was the channel of peculiar traditions, can hardly reappear. Nor can we expect in modern cities the sort of architectural individuality we find in those of Italy, built when each village was a distinct political and social unit. Heine, speaking of Scott, long ago referred to the great pain caused by the loss of national characteristics in consequence of the spread of the newer culture, a pain which now quivers in the heart of all peoples. But the more vital individuality, the cultivation by special groups of peculiar phases of knowledge, art, or conduct, of anything under the heavens in fact, that a few people may agree to pursue will apparently be increased. Since uniformity is cheap and convenient, we may expect it in all matters wherein men do not specially care to assert themselves. We have it in dress and domestic architecture, for instance, just so far as we are willing to take these things ready-made. But when we begin to put ourselves into them, we produce something distinctive. Even languages and national characteristics, if the people really care about them, can be, and in fact are, preserved in spite of political absorption and the assimilating power of communication. There is nothing more notable in recent history than the persistence of nationality, even when, as in Poland, it has lost its political expression. And as to languages, it is said that many, such as Romanian, Bulgarian, Serbian, Finnish, Norse, and Flemish, have revived and come into literary and popular use during the 19th century. Mr. Lecky, in his Democracy and Liberty, declared that there has been in many forms a marked tendency to accentuate distinct national and local types. To assume that a free concourse of ideas will produce uniformity is to beg the whole question. If it be true that men have a natural diversity of gifts, free intercourse should favor its development, especially when we consider that strong instinct which causes man to take pleasure in distinguishing himself and to abhor being lost in the crowd. And as regards the actual tendency of modern life, only an obstinate a priori reasoner will maintain with any confidence the decline of individuality. Those who charge that we possess it in extravagant excess have at least an equal show of reason. Nor, from the standpoint of sentiment, does the modern expansion of feeling and larger sense of unity tend necessarily to a loss of individuality. There is no prospect that self-feeling and ambition will be lost in love's great unity. On the contrary, these sentiments are fostered by freedom and are rather guided than repressed by sympathy. In a truly organic life, the individual is self-conscious and devoted to his own work, but feels himself and that work as part of a large and joyous whole. He is self-assertive, just because he is conscious of being a thread in the great web of events, of serving effectually as a member of a family, a state, of humanity, and of whatever greater whole his faith may picture. If we have not yet an organic society in this sense, we have at least the mechanical conditions that must underlie it. The action of the new communication is essentially stimulating and may, in some of its phases, be injurious. It costs the individual more, in terms of mental effort, to take a normal part in the new order of things than it did in the old. Not only is his outlook broader, inciting him to think and feel about a wider range of matters, but he is required to be a more thoroughgoing specialist in mastering his particular function. Both extension and intention have grown. General culture and technical training are alike more exigent than they used to be, and their demands visibly increase from year to year, not only in the schools but in life at large. The man who does not meet them falls behind the procession and becomes, in some sense, a failure, either unable to make a living or narrow and out of touch with generous movements. Fortunately, from this point of view, our mental functions are as a rule rather sluggish, so that the spur of modern intercourse is for the most part wholesome, awakening the mind, abating sensuality, and giving men idea and purpose. Such ill effect as may be ascribed to it seems to fall chiefly under the two heads of superficiality and strain, which the reader will perceive to be another view of that enlargement and animation discussed in the previous chapter. There is a rather general agreement among observers that, outside of his specialty, the man of our somewhat hurried civilization is apt to have an impatient, touch-and-go habit of mind in both thought and feeling. We are trying to do many and various things, and are driven to versatility and shortcuts at some expense to truth and depth. The habit of inattention, said de Tocqueville about 1835, must be considered as the greatest defect of the democratic character, and recently his judgment has been confirmed by Ostrogorsky, who thinks that deliverance from the bonds of space and time has made the American a man of short views, wedded to the present, accustomed to getting quick returns, and with no deep root anywhere. We have reduced ennui considerably, but a moderate ennui is justly reckoned by Comte and others as one of the springs of progress, and it is no unmixed good that we are too busy to be unhappy. In this matter, as in so many others, we should discriminate so far as we can between permanent conditions of modern life and what is due merely to change, between democracy and confusion. There is nothing in the nature of democracy to prevent its attaining. When transition has somewhat abated, a diverse and stable organization of its own sort, with great advantage to our spiritual composure and productivity. In the meanwhile, it is beyond doubt that the constant and varied stimulus of a confused time makes sustained attention difficult. Certainly, our popular literature is written for those who run as they read, and carries the principle of economy of attention beyond anything previously imagined. And in feeling, it seems true that we tend toward a somewhat superficial kindliness and adaptability rather than sustained passion of any kind. Generally speaking, mind is spread out very thin over our civilization. A good sort of mind, no doubt, but quite thin. All this may be counteracted in various ways, especially by thoroughness in education, and is perhaps to be regarded as lack of maturity rather than incurable defect. Mental strain, despite the alarming opinions sometimes expressed, is by no means a general condition in modern society, nor likely to become so. It is confined to a relatively small number in whom individual weakness, unusual stress, or both have made life too much for the spirit. Yet this number includes many of those who perform the more exacting intellectual functions in business and the professions, as well as peculiarly weak, sensitive, or unfortunate individuals in all walks of life. In general, there is an increase of self-consciousness and choice, more opportunity, more responsibility, more complexity, a greater burden upon intelligence, will, and character. The individual not only can but must deal with a flood of urgent suggestions, or be swamped by them. This age that blots out life with question marks forces us to think and choose whether we are ready or not. Worse, probably, than any amount of work, though that is often destructive, is the anxious insecurity in which our changing life keeps a large part of the population, the well-to-do as well as the poor. And an educated and imaginative people feels such anxieties more keenly than one deadened by ignorance. In America, said de Tocqueville, I saw the freest and most enlightened men placed in the happiest circumstances which the world affords. It seemed to me as if a cloud habitually hung upon their brows, and I thought them serious and almost sad, even in their pleasures. Not long ago, Mr. H. D. Sedgwick contributed to a magazine a study of what he called the New American Type, based on an exhibition of English and American portraits, some recent, some a century old. He found that the more recent were conspicuously marked by signs of unrest and strain. Speaking of Mr. Sargent's subjects, he says, the obvious qualities in his portraits are disquiet, lack of equilibrium, absence of principle, a mind unoccupied by the rightful heirs, as if the home of principle and dogma had been transformed into an inn for wayfarers. Sargent's women, being physically more delicate, more readily reveal the strain of physical and psychical maladjustment. The thin spirit of life shivers pathetically in its fleshly dress. In the intensity of its eagerness, it is unconscious of its spiritual fidgeting on finding itself astray. No path, no blazings, the old forgotten, the new not formed. The early Americans, he says, were not limber-minded men, not readily agnostic, not nicely skeptical. They were 18th century Englishmen. Of Reynolds' women, he observes, these ladies led lives unvexed, natural affections, a few brief saws, a half-dozen principles, kept their brows smooth, their cheeks ripe, their lips most wooable. People had a stable physique and a well-ordered, logical, dogmatic philosophy. The older portraits chant a chorus of praise for national character, for class distinctions, for dogma and belief, for character, for good manners, for honor, for contemplation, for vision to look upon life as a whole, for the appreciation that the world is to be enjoyed, for freedom from democracy, for capacity and lighter mood to treat existence as a comedy told by Goldoni. This may or may not be dispassionately just, but it sets forth one side of the case, made more pertinent by being unpopular, and suggests a very real, though intangible difference between the people of our time and those of a century ago. It is what we feel in literature when we compare the people of Jane Austen with those of the author of The House of Mirth. I do not propose to inquire how far the effects of strain may be seen in an increase of certain distinctly pathological phenomena, such as neurasthenia, the use of drugs, insanity, and suicide. That it has an important influence in this way, difficult, however, to separate from other factors, is generally conceded. In the growth of suicide, we seem to have a statistical demonstration of the destructive effect of social stress at its worst, and of general paralysis, which is rapidly increasing and has been called the disease of the century. We are told that it is the disease of excess, of vice, of overwork, of prolonged worry. It is especially the disease of great urban centers, and its existence usually seems to show that the organism has entered upon a competitive race for which it is not fully equipped. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this video, I suggest you to subscribe to the channel so that you will be notified when new videos are out. Also, you might want to check our link in the description, where you'll find many other fundamental advertising and psychology books in different languages. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again in the next video.